This is the Hurt Locker, a bunch of victims who, through no fault of their own, had to go up against the most complete killing machine ever against their kind. They had the advantage of being left-handed all the way through their lives, and then they arrived at Test cricket and they ran into Ashwin. Ed Cowan batted 32 times in Tests, and in 10 of those innings he faced Ashwin. 7 of those he was dismissed. Against non-Ashwins, Cowan averaged 36. Perhaps not enough to save his skin, but maybe to buy some more time. Against Ashwin, he averaged 16.7. It's not fair to say Ashwin ended his career, because Cowan started against Ashwin. He paid the left-handed tax more than most in what ended up being a very short career because of that man. Let me put it this way. Cowan faced 313 balls from Ashwin. That's about 13% of his career deliveries, which also happens to be the most balls he faced of any bowler in Test cricket. Now let me get a bit crazier. Cowan actually did okay against Ashwin. Against left-handers, Ashwin's average is 18.95. Cowan was south of that, but not by much. Now this includes Ashwin versus the tail as well, but to face 313 balls in 10 innings is actually pretty good for a lefty versus Ashwin. Let's head back to the Hurt Locker. There is someone way worse than Cowan, Stiaan van Zyl. Here is a career that just got completely Ashwined. He batted in 17 innings, 5 of those against Ashwin, and all 5 times he was dismissed. A third of his Test dismissals in 55 balls, and he averaged 2.6 runs against him. You take Ashwin out of this very short career, and you have Van Zyl almost averaging 40, which considering his bowling talent is probably more than enough. You put Ashwin in, and he's averaging 26. He only got 2 more series after Ashwin, and then he was gone. But there are so many more who struggled. Phil Hughes went 5 times at an average of 7.8. Daniel Flynn 4 times for 10.8. Ben Duckett 3 wickets for 5 runs, and Kumar Sangakkara 4 times at an average of 5.75. The whole thing is cruel. There are only 4 batters who stand on that side of the bat who've ever averaged over 50 against him. Chris Rogers, Sam Curran, Matt Renshaw, and Mike Hussey. And I kinda cheated with Hussey, because this wicket is a run out. Hussey is one of the 15 of the 78 left-handers to have ever faced Ashwin and survived. No left-hander has ever made 50 runs against Ashwin without being dismissed. In fact, 77 lefties have faced him, and only 9 of those have survived to tell the tale. This is carnage. And not only does Ashwin have the most wickets in the history of the game against lefties, which is something on its own, but in the ball-by-ball era, he also has the best average as well against them. I would assume that one way or another, it's pretty safe to say that Ashwin has been the best bowler throughout the history of cricket when it comes to left-handers. And not everyone likes him. We don't have the full record for Sean Pollock, but we do have quite a few of the balls he bowled in Test cricket. And he's remarkably bad against left-handers. Stephen Harmison and Shannon Gabriel are the same. And obviously there are a lot of left-arm finger spinners who don't like them that much either. But there are even off-spinners who aren't particularly good against left-handers. Neither Saqlain Mushtaq or Murali were better against left-handers than right-handers. This list shows how much better these bowlers were against left-hand batters by percentage. The ones who are really good against lefties are on the left, as you might have guessed. Now there is a reason for Saqlain, as he almost turned himself into a leg spinner for the second part of his career after inventing his version of the doosra. And Murali was not quite at that level, but again he went very heavy on a ball that went the other way. So neither of these guys were set up to destroy left-handers. But Ashwin, and also Graham Swan, certainly were. And even when Ashwin had the ball that went the other way, he's always been off-break dependent. In Swan's case, he really only had 2 major deliveries, the undercutting straight one and the one that turns. But there's also another big difference in the careers of the players we've talked about so far, DRS. And the one player that was involved before and after that is Murali. So we have some very good data on him. So I've had a look at him from 99 till 2005. And the reason I've picked 2005 is when you look at the data, that's the point where umpires start changing their decisions when it comes to LBWs. Well before DRS, they're looking at the TV and they're correcting their decisions. Spinners are getting a lot more LBWs and seamers are getting less at that point. And from incomplete balls in that period, Murali averages 14.41 against right-handers. You probably have to pause for that one. And 38 against left-handers. From 2005 until he retired, however, it was 21.5 against right-handers and 23.6 against lefties. And if you just want to go from when DRS actually enters the game, Murali averaged 34 against right-handers and 27 against lefties in that period. It's quite clear that DRS changed things. Another cricketer worth looking at is Syed Ajmal, who was also much better against right-handers than left-handers and played almost exclusively in the DRS era. And a bit like Saqlain Mushtaq, his thing was the doosra. So this is Kumar Sangakkara versus Ajmal and Ashwin. You can see that while they're both off-spinners, they were way different. Saqlain, Ajmal and Murali were off-spinners plus, whereas Ashwin can spin the ball away from right-handers, but it's not a strong ball for him. Which means that he's had to double down on his normal off-spinning talents, which is spinning the ball away from left-handers. The bowler I could find that was most like him was Harbhajan Singh. They're still not exactly like for like, And while they can both move the ball the other way, you can see that Harbhajan was worse against southpaws than right-handers. And so I looked at Harbhajan just after the 2005 mark, and what do you know? In the first half of the data, he was really quite poor against left-handers when compared to the right-handers. And the second half of his career, he flipped back in favour of lefties a little bit. There is no doubt that starting in 2005, off-spin got a lot more difficult for left-handers. And so I wanted to check if the same thing was right for righties versus left-arm orthodox. And it was. In fact, the drop was almost identical. And what about bowlers who spin the ball back in? Well, it didn't affect left-handers against orthodox bowling at all, but the righties almost lifted by as much as they dropped against off-spin. But I think the more interesting thing here is how close the right-handers used to be. Only 2 runs apart no matter which way the ball was turning, and now it's over 6 runs. So essentially, it's really clear that the DRS era has at least made it far tougher to face the ball spinning out than in. But left-handers just aren't making as many runs as they used to. When you look at the top 7 batters, they were averaging over 40 for an 8-year period. And in 2003, they almost averaged 50, which is wrong. They were absolute studs, while right-handers were stuck around the mid-30s. Then in 2009, they slipped under right-handers, and they've been behind ever since, except for the last couple of years. So I wondered how long lefties had been better than righties in general. And it turns out that since the 1950s, 2010 to 2020 is the first time where right-handers averaged more. There have been a couple of closer ones. But in truth, right-handers have always averaged less against left-handers for over 50 years. And you can see that as left-handers have got better and better, we've found a way to play more of them in games. We only saw over 20% of left-handers in 1 decade before the 1960s, and it hasn't been under since. And the last 2 decades have been over 30%, and so is this one so far. And you can see from 2000 to 2010 was the time that we faced them most. And then there's been a little bit of a drop. And so really before the year 2000, there was no reason for left-hander specialists. But as they've become 1 in 3 batters at the professional level, bowlers are getting used to bowling at them a lot more. Some will be picked just because of this skill, and the plans are getting better. Of course, DRS has certainly played a part here, and not just for spinners. You can see in the first part of the ball by ball era, there really wasn't much of a difference between bowling over the wicket and around the wicket, with a right arm seam bowler to a left-handed batter. But then for 6 years, left-handed batters were being destroyed by right arm bowlers coming around the wicket. And there are a number of reasons why that happened, but it also has gone into the fact that left-handers are not making as many runs now. If you look at all bowlers in the last 4 years, there are 7 bowlers going at less than 22 runs per wicket against left-handed. And while Ashwin still leads the way with an absurd 16 average, the rest are seamers, mostly right arm. So it's clear that DRS and a bunch of other factors over the last couple of years are really just not helping left-handed batters. Even if there's been a slight swing back to left-handers recently, it still seems like in some ways the bubble might have burst. And if you go back to the top 5 of the best bowlers against left-handers since the ball-by-ball era, you will see that number 3 in the list is Graham Swan, number 4 is Dilruwan Pereira, and number 5 is Nathan Lyon. These are all your traditional off-spinners, and they've all bowled heavily in the DRS era. Swan is the only one who might have even been better than Ashwin against left-handers, purely because he didn't get as much assistance on home pitches. But Ashwin has more wickets, has had a longer career, and at this point is basically Godzilla when it comes to left-handers. He destroys them in big batches. And we might one day find an older bowler who had an even better record against left-handers than Ashwin. But because there were so few, and now they are everywhere, that means that Ashwin is the perfect creation for modern cricket. He is good enough against right-handers to be a consistent threat, and he devours the souls of left-handers unfortunate enough to stand in front of it. Take this series against New Zealand, who are not a nation that ever produced much left-handed batting. They create plodding openers and middle-order maestros, but only a quarter of their runs in history are from lefties. But in the last 5 years, they've been all about the southpaws. They are just a fraction behind Sri Lanka and England as the highest percentage of runs from lefties. And their left-handers have been really good. The majority of that is from Tom Latham and Henry Nicholls, but Jeet Ravel and a bunch of guys down the order with the recent addition of Devon Conway have been involved there too. And Latham and Nicholls are pretty good against off-spin, all things told. They're certainly better than most left-handers against it. Though even of recent times, Nicholls has started to struggle. And as I showed in the previous video of him, his loss of form is almost all down to off-spin. But Latham, Conway and Nicholls combined averaged 13.3 against Ashwin coming into the first test against India. And turning up to India with left-handers is like being asked to forfeit wickets at this point. It's unfair. I mean, they might make runs at the other end, if they can even get their way there. But through Ashwin's own skill, technology and a surge in lefties batting in tests, he's become the most incredible southpaw slaying machine in the history of the game. And don't ask me about it, ask his victims.